How to implement the ISO 27001 standard for information security. Today we're going to go through the ISO 27001 standard and look at good practice guides, tips and a view on the best way to implement ISO 27001 to meet your business requirements and in order to ensure that you pass the audit with the auditors. So let's go through 27001 and look at the detail and look at what it is that you need to do in order to pass the standard. So the standard comes in the 27001 2013 format, which you can see here. On the screen we've got the contents, and the standard is constructed in two parts. The first part is the mandatory aspects of the standard. The second part is the control objectives and the controls that are required only as a result of your risk assessment. So when you undertake your audits and when you define your ISMS, the mandatory part of the standard is what you absolutely have to do. The control objectives in Annex A are effectively optional, though you have to demonstrate why they're optional, and you have to ensure that your risk assessment is sufficient to prove to the auditor why it is that you haven't included them. So let's go through the ISO standard. Just to look at the contents, you can see that the standard is broken into about 10 items. The introduction, the scope of the standard, references that define the content of the standard, some of the definitions of terms, and then we go into the mandatory elements. So the definition of the context within your organization, a requirement around leadership commitment to the information security management system, something around how you plan and address risks within your organization, the support for your ISMS, the operational aspects of your ISMS, how the ISMS is evaluated, and finally how to improve it. And then in Annex A, which is the non-mandatory aspect, we have the control objectives, and you are quite at liberty to pick whatever control objectives and whatever control objective framework you wish, although in practice, if you do not choose the Annex A controls, you will have to justify to the assessor why you have selected that control set. But there may be, for some industries, for example regulated industries and government industries, where you have specific requirements from your risk assessment method to use alternate controls and compensating controls. So let's go through and let's step through the detail of the standard. Moving on to the next page, there's the foreword, which explains a little bit about the ISO organization. And then we have the introduction. The introduction again is introduction about the standard and about the organizational structure of the standard and how the ISO organization expects the standard to be implemented. Now we get on to the main body of the mandatory elements of the standard, where it starts with defining the scope of the standard. It defines what the standard covers. It goes through the references and the definitions for security, and it points to ISO 27000, which is the source of definitions. And of course, when you write your information security ISMS, when you write your policies, when you write your procedures, if you use the ISO standard definitions, then that will give you an easy ride or an easier ride into your audit and will enable you to get the compliance with the standard. So the next item is the context of your organization. So your organizational context is the first part that you have to document and that you have to ensure is made apparent within your ISMS, and it's probably easiest to document this within your policy or within your ISMS management document. So what you have to do here in your document is you have to determine the internal and external issues relevant to your organization, and that basically means listing the internal stakeholders, the external stakeholders, and any other relevant parties. So you might, for instance, include your customers, you might include business units, you might include law enforcement, government, you might include suppliers, you might include clients. Internal business units, internal stakeholders, you might include the legal team, the HR team, you might include the IT team. Whatever it is that is peculiar to your business and your organization. The key here is to keep it as broad as possible and to ensure that all possible stakeholders are included. And when you get audited, typically your auditor is looking simply that you have documented your organization and you have understood the stakeholders who are involved within your business. And that understanding of your stakeholders helps you to understand and ensure that your assessment of risk has been well constructed. And when you are building your scope, and your scope has to be a Goldilocks scope, in other words not too broad, not too narrow, the auditor will naturally want you to include as much as you can in your internal and external issues, and your desire will likely to be to reduce that to keep it manageable. The next item, 4.2, is that you need to understand the needs and the expectations of interested parties. So that means you have to identify the interested parties relevant to your information security management system, and you have to identify the requirements of those interested parties. So what you might decide here is that your interested parties are, for example, customers. Your customers buy stuff from your website, and therefore the requirements of those interested parties are that data is adequately protected and that the confidentiality, integrity and availability of data is adequately maintained. And I suggest that the requirements of most of your interested parties will follow a very similar process and a very similar set of criteria. In other words, they all require that their data is adequately protected from compromise in terms of confidentiality, it's not able to be changed inappropriately, and it's available when needed. The next step in your process is to determine the scope of your ISMS. This is probably the hardest part of the initial phase of defining the ISMS. You absolutely have to define a Goldilocks scope. So the Goldilocks scope is not too broad, in other words, so broad that you try to boil the ocean, you try to audit too much, not so narrow that it is meaningless, and your assessor decides that the scope isn't appropriate to the service that you are offering. So when you define the scope, you have to refer in the scope to the external and internal issues, you have to refer to the requirements, and you have to refer to the interfaces and dependencies between the organization and any other organization. And very importantly, you have to document your scope, and I recommend that you include your scope in the ISMS management document. You can have a separate scope document if you wish, and that will be another document that you have to maintain, that you have to edit every year, that you have to update every year. So I recommend that you include it in your management document, and I recommend that you include a diagram. So a diagram that includes all of the assets that are in scope of your certification, and part of the diagram you might want to also include those assets that are not in scope of the diagram. So you will draw a boundary around the business units or the systems that are in scope, and outside of the boundary you can have the organizations, the systems upon which you have a reliance, and you can call that the reliance scope if you wish, or they are the parts of the business that you are not directly accounted for within the ISMS, and you need to make sure that your the organizations within your reliance are adequately assured, because you will be asked to provide evidence that the organizations that you rely on are actually secure. So, for example, you might have the case where you are using cloud services provided by, say, AWS, Google, Azure, and clearly your organization does not personally assure those external bodies. What you would do in your scope is you would say that your web server and the web service is in scope of your certification, but Google or AWS or Azure is out of scope, and the interface between the two is the contract, and the interface is the management of that service. And as a note on scope, I would also suggest that your business functions within your organization are also managed as an arm's length scope, so that, for example, your IT organization is a reliance for your business, so that you don't have to manage the IT assets if you can. And if you consider your internal IT organization in exactly the same way had you outsourced to a third-party service provider, and if you can manage the relationship through metrics, reports, and a light touch relationship, then you don't have to get into the detail of list every single server, list every single workstation, prove that every workstation has got antivirus, prove that every server has got a specific control, because you can use the reports from the service management organization to demonstrate that.